I'm the Reverend Diane Shepherd. I'm the priest here at Church of the Redeemer, and I've been the support for the folks that pulled this together, and we owe them thanks. Thanks also for coming today, and welcome from those of us who are part of Church of the Redeemer.
Thank you, Diane. On behalf of the three panelists and the Social Justice Committee of the Church of the Redeemer, I want to thank all of you for coming today. Our pastor and priest, the Reverend Diane Shepherd, is owed thanks for her guidance and blessing of this event. Thanks also to the chair of our Social Justice Committee, Dr. Marianne Novi of Pitt's English Department. Marianne, would you raise your hand so people can see and know who you were? Thanks to Redeemer's good friend, Charles Pearson, attorney and student of U.S.-Pakistani relations, and author of the Post-Gazette op-ed February 12th titled, "What About the Civilians?" Copies of Charles's op-ed are on the table over here. It was Charles Pearson who brought this idea for the panel to our church, and Marianne and Charles worked very hard to secure this outstanding panel for us. I'd like to introduce them at this moment, and they'll sit here and deliver their remarks. They each will talk for 15 to 20 minutes, and at the end of the time when all three of them have talked, we'll have hopefully a half hour of questions and answers. First of all, Assistant Professor Susan Haskell of Duquesne University School of Law, who has done some work in the field of Islamic law. And then secondly, we have Endowed Chair Professor Jules Lebel of the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. And finally, Dr. Ronald Stone, who is the John Witherspoon Professor Emeritus of Ethics at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Would you give them, all three of them, a warm welcome?
I'd just like to say thank you so much for inviting me here today. I'm very honored to be a part of this distinguished panel and to be here at the Church of the Redeemer. And I'd also just like to start out by saying Assalamu alaikum, everybody. And that means peace be with you. This is what Muslims say when they greet one another. And
I'm sorry, you need the microphone closer.
okay, how's that?
That's better. Even closer. That's better.
Salam alaikum. Said it right. And I think that's important to start with because there is an impression that a lot of people have about Islam that they get from negative media, the webs, and obviously the terrorists who promote a very deviant form of Islam, if you can even call it Islam. And the focus of my talk here, obviously, is on the drone program and whether the drone program comports with the just war theory as outlined under Islamic law. The simple answer is absolutely not. In Islam, there is a long tradition of just war theory. They may not call it just war theory, but it began in the 700s and is one of the earliest articulation of the law of war. And so what I'm going to be doing is first talking about the classical Islamic law of war, and then moving into the contemporary setting and talking about terrorism, and also the drone program and how that relates to classical Islamic just war theory. So as I've said, the drone program does not comport with Islamic Sharia. This is my opinion, and I'm sure it is shared with the vast majority of Muslims and Islamic scholars who know anything at all about classical Islamic law and Sharia. I think I should also begin by saying something about Sharia. Sharia is the religious law of Islam. It is based on the Quran and the Sunnah, which means the example of the Prophet Muhammad, and also includes the sayings of the Prophet, which are called hadith. Okay. Fiqh, on the other hand, is the jurisprudence of Sharia that began over 1,400 years ago, and that is the gloss on the Sharia that the scholars have put onto the Sharia, the interpretations of the Sharia. Okay. Islamic law, on the other hand, usually is a term that is used to include both the Sharia and the fiqh. Because the fiqh is a man-made jurisprudence, that of course is open to change. This is somewhat controversial. However, most modern progressive scholars believe that the writings of the scholars that were done in the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century are not necessarily set in stone, because unlike the Revelation, which is the Sharia, the Quran and the Sunnah, this is not something that comes from God. All right, it is a man-made gloss and interpretation of the Sharia. All right, so in the early Islamic period, in the 7th century, this is when the Prophet Muhammad came, the community of Muslims was very, very small. And they started out in Mecca, and they were attacked by the Meccans. They moved to Medina, and this is called the Hijrah. And this is the beginning of the Islamic calendar, is actually 622, when they moved to Medina. And so in this early period, because the Islamic community was under attack, there are many verses in the Quran and sayings of the Prophet that have to do with being under attack and war. And I have included in the materials today some of those verses. They're sometimes called the sword verses. These verses are often taken out of context from the Quran itself, and they are used by extremists to promote this idea that Islam is a religion of warfare, etc. However, there are also many, many verses in the Quran that talk about peace and love and forgiveness and all of those sorts of ideas that very much are in line with the rest of the Abrahamic traditions. Okay. Soon after the Muslim community moved to Medina, a few decades later, they decided that they needed to move back to Mecca, and they took over Mecca and made Mecca safe for the Muslims. Mecca was very important because that's where the Kaaba is located. And so it's during this period that the first law of war was developed. Muhammad was very, very specific in instructing his followers how to conduct this takeover of Mecca. They used peaceful means as much as possible. They were not to hurt non-combatants, not to hurt children, women, old people. And they gave the people of Mecca a choice to convert to Islam or not to convert to Islam. And so many of the ideas that were put forth during this period, both through revelation that ended up as verses in the Quran, or also through the teachings of the Prophet, form the basis of just war theory in Islam. So, as I'm going to explain a little bit further in the talk, a little bit more, I don't believe that the Islamic War of War actually applies to the U.S. drone program because under the Islamic law, no actual war has been justifiably declared. Okay? And so the way I look at what's going on with the drone program in response to terrorist attacks, supposed terrorist attacks from other individuals in other countries, is actually more properly characterized as a criminal law issue. But first I'm going to talk a little bit more about just war theory under Islamic law. There are two different types of wars that are considered just. One is a war of defense, and I talked a little bit about that because the original community was under so much attack. So it wasn't just a religious community, it was also a social, economic, political community. So they had to develop a religious law for dealing with conflict. Okay? So that's the first one. Also, shortly after, in the very first few centuries of Islam, because it's an expansionist religion, they did expand their territory. They basically filled in the gap left by the Roman Empire that had fallen. And so there are specific rules that were developed about how you should go into other countries and expand Islam. And you have to keep in mind, we didn't really have city-states. There was a vast, variety of different types of political organization. There were tribes, there were city-states, you know. So in expanding Islam, these ideas about how you should treat non-combatants and how you should treat prisoners of war and women, children, and non-Muslims were developed and adhered to for the most part. So there's an idea that was developed during this time about the rule of peace and the rule of proportionality. There's a famous verse in the Quran that has to do with this, and it says, if you have to respond to attack, make your response proportionate. But it is best to stand fast. In other words, if you don't have to respond to an attack in a defensive manner, it is best not to use violence. So find some other way to deal with the conflict. So this further emphasizes this theme of peace and also proportionality that runs through Islamic law. Is there a justification ever for collateral damage, as we see in the drone situation? Only if you are in a justified defensible war situation, then obviously sometimes you're going to have collateral damage. That's not, I don't think that's applicable to the drone situation because we don't have a actual war that's been declared, okay? So here's an interesting side note. I know I should probably be hurrying along here, but the contribution of Muslim thinkers to international law is actually quite astounding. The very first book that was written about international law, which was of course focused on the law of war, was written in the 8th century, and it's called Al-Siyar al-Kabir, written by a student of Imam Hanifa and Abu Yusuf. Hanifa formed one of the 4 different schools of thought of Islamic law, the Hanafi school. And in this work, Siyar, it's called the Siyar for short, Shaibani carefully considers the conditions of just war and how to achieve peace, sets out the principles of military conduct, and many of these principles would be very familiar to anyone who has studied international law, humanitarian law. They closely comport to what we've come up with in quote-unquote the West in the last 100 years. They were doing this in the 7th century. Of course, there are some differences, but at any rate, in this early period of expansion, there was this idea, which has been picked up by some of these terrorist types, that there are 2 realms. There's the realm of war and the realm of peace, okay? And where the Muslims live and are in charge is the realm of peace, and everybody else is the realm of war. More contemporary scholars have explained that this distinction really doesn't fit into our global situation now. Tariq Ramadan, by the way, is one of these. He's a famous Muslim scholar, and he's actually called for a repeal of this distinction. However, this is something that is used by these radical extremist political Islamic groups like Al-Qaeda to justify their fight against the West, okay? But if you look at it from our point of view, and what I'm trying to do here is apply the Islamic law of war to what we're doing. If we were Muslims, could we say that the people who live in Afghanistan and Yemen and Pakistan and all these different places where we're using the drones, are we considering everybody else somebody that we're at war with? The whole rest of the world is the realm of war? I don't agree with that. And I don't think that that idea translates to what we're doing. However, if we declare a war on terror, we've pretty much declared a war on everybody out there who is not us. Yeah. So I don't think it works for them, and I don't think we should try to do that either. Anyway, so coming back to the classical law of war, jus in bellum, who must fight? Well, it depends. It depends on what kind of war you're having. You have a regular war, which I've just talked about, defensive war, and a war of expansion. Well, adult males only are required to fight. However, there's another sort of war And that is a war to protect Islam. Some people call that a jihad. The word jihad is used incorrectly in most instances. So I'll put that off to the side for a moment. But if we have a defensive war, who must fight? Well, adult males. And when must they fight? Well, they have to fight immediately. But again, you are limited. You are not to kill non-combatants. You should, before you even begin fighting, whether you are invading a territory in a defensive manner or you are trying to expand Islam, before you even begin aggressive behavior, you're supposed to give those people a chance to lay down their arms, to accept Islam, etc. Okay, if they don't accept Islam, actually, that's fine. You can keep your religion because there's no compulsion in religion. You pay a tax. You don't have all equal rights, but that's okay. Now, the other sort of war, fighting in the cause of Allah, okay, this is sometimes called a jihad. There's a greater jihad and a lesser jihad. The greater jihad is struggling to be a better person, to live according to God's will, struggling against the self, basically. Okay, that's the greater jihad. Lesser jihad, again, we go back in history and we look at the history of Muslims. It's an attack on Islam. So if you have an attack on Islam, then the whole community should be involved in doing whatever they can to repel this attack. However, who can declare these wars? Well, the wars of expansion and the wars of defense can only be declared under classical Islamic law by the Khalif, the leader, okay, against another political entity, another group of people. We don't have that in our situation right now. When we're talking about the war on terror, which we're using the drone programs for. There's no leader of a country that's declared war on us. We have non-state actors, we have individuals, we have rogues, we have groups of people, networks of people. Nor have we actually declared war on any other state. Okay? So this drone program doesn't fit into that category. Do they believe, those who are using terrorist methods, that they are fighting a legitimate jihad, lesser jihad, against the West? Yes, they do. Are they correct? Absolutely not. Who can declare a jihad? Well, only an imam, for instance, can declare a jihad. These groups, however, have no reputable religious scholars to support this, and again, they are not state actors. They are individuals who are parts of networks. So this lesser jihad excuse for what they're doing doesn't work for them, doesn't work for us either. Okay? Bin Laden and his ilk do not qualify as an imam capable of issuing any sort of fatwa that should hold any weight with anybody. They're not religiously trained, you know. They have no background as scholars. So when they issue these fatwas, they are really of no effect, not even persuasive effect for anyone who understands what a lesser jihad is supposed to be under Islamic law. So now that I've disposed of that, it's not a war, okay? We have individuals acting outside of jihad and outside of just war. How does a state respond to that situation? Well, we haven't declared war against a state because a state is not fighting us. So what do we have? We have criminal action. At the beginning of the Muslim period, there were assassinations that took place. There were the Qajarites who decided that they were against Ali, who was the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet. They murdered him. So this sort of activity of assassination, political assassination, attacking individuals, has been condemned in Islam for a very, very, very long time. And it can be categorized as either a haq Allah, a crime against Allah, or a haq adami, a crime against another human being. If we were to categorize this as a haq Allah, it would be under the category of a crime called hiraba, which is sometimes limited to highway robbery, but other scholars, both classical and contemporary, have expanded the sorts of crimes that would constitute the crime of haraba. Haraba is a crime where somebody strives for chaos in the land, creates mischief in the land, makes everybody very uncomfortable, fearful, etc. Riding in the night, in the cover of night, stealing from people, etc. Like that creates a situation of fear in general. And so some contemporary authors have said that what these terrorists are doing is actually one of these very serious crimes, the had or hudud crimes that are haq Allah and are subject to some of the harshest penalties under classical Islamic law. So I believe that terrorism can be categorized under one of these crimes. So if it's a crime, can we send our drones out there to another country and just blow these people away under Islamic law? No. If you have a haq Allah crime, a hudud crime that's at issue, from the very beginning of Islam, we're talking 1,400 years of jurisprudence, there is a very strict code of procedure that you have to follow before you can condemn someone to death or banishment or whatever the punishment is under this category of crime. You have to have certain witnesses, and if there's any doubt, not reasonable doubt, any doubt, the qadi, the judge, needs to find in favor of the defendant. We haven't followed any of those procedures when we just send drones out and through some hidden process decide someone needs a killing. We haven't provided anybody with any open due process, and there's no judge that has made this decision that this person has actually committed that crime, much less doing this preemptively. We think this person is going to commit the crime. All right. The other possible categorization of this terrorist activity is basically a tort under Islamic law. I've written a couple of papers on it, and it is a intentional killing or homicide. And if it is to be considered an intentional killing or homicide, then the victim's family is supposed to be involved in the decision-making as to what the punishment is. And again, coming back to mercy and forgiveness in Islam, the victim's family members get to decide whether there will be a proportional retribution, whether there will be restitution, money paid, or forgiveness. So just to wrap up, that's my take on this. I'm not representing anybody in the Muslim community. This is my own opinion as somebody who researches in this area. But the drone program is not justified at all under Islamic law because, number one, there's no actual war. And number two, if these are crimes, the people who are committing them are not being afforded due process as required under Islamic law.
Thank you,
Thank you for inviting me. I'd like to present a different paradigm on these drones than I usually presented. Most of the time, the debate is focused on drones as a new technology of warfare, a new method of warfare, a method of warfare you could kill somebody 5,000 miles away by somebody pressing a button in Virginia. To me, in terms of this talk, what I'd like to focus on is not drones as new, but drones as a continuation of the military and foreign policy of the United States. In particular, the Bush policy, which I think drones has allowed the Obama administration to continue. And if we go back even to Clinton, if you remember the Kosovo War or the Yugoslav War, we flew thousands of missions, not using drones, but using Air Force bombers, fighters, and cruise missiles. And we killed thousands of people, including many civilians, without losing a single pilot, a single combatant. And it was the same basic feature of these drones, being able to wreak havoc and fear on another population without our soldiers being killed. So I'd like to focus on drones as a continuation of the old and not something that's new. I think that this drone policy has allowed allowed Obama to continue the Bush policies in 4 critical ways. The first was alluded to in the first talk, which is it has allowed Obama to engage in a worldwide war on terrorism, which was Bush's whole formulation. Congress, in enacting the authorization after September 11th for warfare, pointedly did not give him the power to wage a full-scale war on terror, but gave him a power to wage war against the people who had attacked us on September 11th. And the Supreme Court in the Hamdi case said that allows the Bush administration to detain even American citizens who are combatants in Afghanistan in fighting war against the United States. Well, what this drone policy has allowed Obama to do is to wage war in Yemen, Somalia, and presumably other places, and the far wide reaches of Pakistan, with no geographical limit, no clear enemy. And the basic concept that they've used is that we're waging war not against al-Qaeda, but against al-Qaeda and all, in quotes, associated forces, with associated forces not being defined. So that means that somebody who is an Islamic militant or an extremist in any country in the world can now be attacked by a drone without any notice, without any hearing, as part of a worldwide war against not just al-Qaeda, but all associated forces undefined. This could not happen, I don't think, really without the use of drones, or at least it couldn't happen to the extent that it has been happening, because they'd have to either use American soldiers or American bombers, and it would be much more difficult. At least drones has made it easier to continue this worldwide war on terror that Bush first started. And not a simple war, or simple is not the right word, but not simply the war against al-Qaeda. Secondly, it has continued the policy of waging war through secrecy and an intelligence-based war, as opposed to the typical kind of war, which is a war based on fighting a known enemy, where you're attacking an enemy which fights back. In the case of the Bush administration, it was developed through the use of secret prisons, secret renditions, secret intelligence gathering. Here, if you look at the drone policy, the key features of it is secrecy and lack of transparency, which is one of the key bases of the attack on the drone policy. The criteria for who we kill is secret, never been announced. The targets are secret. The killings are not announced. In fact, in many cases, in the case of Yemen, the Yemenis government takes credit for the killings, and it's actually the CIA that's doing it. And in a way, this is equivalent to what used to happen in Latin America with disappearances, which is, and which international law said is illegal. And it's not just illegal because it's murder. Murder is, and summary execution is one thing, but there's a separate category under international law, which is disappearances, which is executing somebody where the government does not take responsibility for it. So in Argentina, Chile, all around Latin America, governments engage in disappearances where they killed people, they summarily executed people without ever taking accountability for it. And so you have the mothers in Argentina saying, what we want to know is who killed our kids and our family members. And this is the same thing that's happening with the drones. Namely, the US government is killing people all around the world without taking any responsibility for it, without any accountability, purely on secrecy. And it's, as I say, continuing a policy of secrecy and non-accountability, which the Bush administration first started. By the way, on the first point, I think the broad point on this worldwide war on terror is that the warfare model for this, which I'll get into, is basically not appropriate for this kind of war. But the drones has allowed it to continue based on an ideology that this is war. And for the reasons I'll get into in a minute, the warfare model I don't think is appropriate. With secrecy and with non-accountability, of course, comes the killing of civilians. And how many civilians have been killed, we can estimate, but we don't know. Just like, and it's the same policy with Guantanamo. We had no idea who was in Guantanamo for many years because the government refused to release it. All they would tell us is what Rumsfeld told us, which is, trust us, these are the worst of the worst. Now, the Obama administration, John Brennan, who's now the head of the CIA and who was Obama's key advisor in this drone warfare, made a statement a year ago, and it was, to me, unbelievable. It's the same as the Rumsfeld statement. He said that over the last year, we have not killed one single non-combatant in all this drone warfare. Now, how did he know that? He knew that because of their intelligence. We've been using this intelligence to that, and we can assure the American people that we haven't killed anybody. What's the basis for that? Trust us. It's the same basis that Rumsfeld used. And if you trust them, you'll buy anything. In fact, I'm currently involved litigating a case involving prolonged solitary confinement, California, and the California prison officials say, we have intelligence, which is that all 1,000 people that we've put in solitary confinement are all gang members. Well, how do you know? Not because they've done anything, not because they've shot and killed anybody or assaulted anybody, but we have secret intelligence, and you have to trust us. And in warfare, when an enemy soldier kills one of your soldiers, you can shoot them back. Or in fact, if they're running around aiming a gun at you, you could shoot them before they shoot you. But this is not the typical form of warfare. This is warfare based on an intelligence model, which is that we know who the enemy is. We're not going to tell you. We're not going to tell them. We're just going to blow them up. And that's a fundamentally different form of warfare than has historically taken place. Intelligence has always been, obviously, I wouldn't call it intelligence, but spy services have always been a part of warfare. But it hasn't been the primary aspect of warfare, and this makes it into the primary aspect. The third point, which is an international law point, which is why I think this doesn't really fit a warfare model, is if you look at the Obama, what they have said, which, as I said, is limited about drone warfare, it has stretched to the point of extinction the difference of the distinction in international law between the categories of civilian and combatant. Clearly, when you have one army attacking another army, two states, and there's soldiers fighting, you know who the combatants are. In this case, with non-state actors, you don't know who the combatants are. So the question is, who is a legitimate target? And in the one white paper that was leaked by the government, so we know what they say, well, we're acting in self-defense, and therefore somebody who is engaged in an imminent attack against us, we can attack. And that is true under international law. You can attack if a country's going to attack you imminently, or some non-state actor is engaged in a plot and they're about to blow up Times Square, you can attack them. But the key rub of this is how they define imminent. They define imminent in the following way. Imminent is not what you would think it is, which is immediate. Imminent is defined in the following. It does not require the United States, this I'm reading from the white paper, does not require the United States to have clear evidence that a specific attack on U.S. persons and interests will take place in the immediate future. So if they don't need evidence that an attack is going to take place in the immediate future, what do they need? All they need is that there is some leader or operational figure in Al-Qaeda who is associated with Al-Qaeda, and that makes it ipso facto imminent. And that was the justification for killing Anwar al-Awlaki, Now, under that definition of imminence, the distinction between civilian and combatant falls away because everybody can be attacked. And to again show you why this is similar to the Bush administration, the war in Iraq was also based on a Orwellian, and I think this is Orwellian, redefinition of the term imminence. Under international law, we can only attack Iraq if they were imminently going to attack us. And it was clear that they weren't imminently going to attack us. So Bush said, well, don't worry, they will attack us at some time in the future. And therefore, you laughed, this was in the National Security White Paper, and this is what Rice said. Therefore, this is imminent. It's imminent not in the sense that it's going to happen immediately, but it's imminent in the sense that it will happen at some point. And how do we know it's going to happen at some point? Because we have intelligence, which, by the way, they said is 100% true, which we now know is 100% false, that this will happen. And it's again the same stretching of the notion of imminence that Obama is doing here. The second aspect of this undermining of distinction between civilian and combatant, which is key to the laws of war, namely that under the Geneva Conventions you cannot attack a civilian but only a combatant, is who is a civilian. And one of the key aspects of these drone strikes is what's called signature strikes, which is that if they're a group of young men and they're acting suspiciously, they must be terrorists and we can blow them up. Now, under, again, that notion, there's very little distinction between a civilian and a combatant. They've used hundreds of these signature strikes in Pakistan, claiming, of course, that they're all fighters, that that's why they don't attack any civilians, because all these are fighters. If you look at just what we know, of course, that they are killing many civilians. For example, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the organization that I work with, has a case now on behalf of the son of Anwar al-Awlaki. Anwar al-Awlaki was allegedly a top leader of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is an associated or affiliated group with al-Qaeda. And he was killed by a drone. But what's not generally known is that several weeks later, his 16-year-old son and 6 other people were also killed by a drone. And it was clearly a mistake, but they don't acknowledge it. There's no acknowledgement of any of these attacks. In Yemen, there was an attack in which 42 people were killed 6 months ago, 21 of whom were civilians. So the mounting civilian toll is not simply because of the drone as a weapon, because of course there's been a mounting civilian toll when American soldiers come to a village and kill civilians, or where cruise missiles kill civilians. It has to do with a defining of warfare in a way which undermines the distinction between civilian and combatant, and which is endemic to this whole notion of the war on terror, and which Obama's continued, and he's been able to continue in part because of this new technology. Last, but not least, this new technology has allowed Obama to continue to rely on the notion of military force to defeat terrorism. So when you ask administration officials how effective has the drones been, they say, oh, it's been incredibly effective. It's decimated al-Qaeda and its leadership, and that may well be true. I have no independent way of knowing that or not knowing that, because again, the whole thing is secret. But assuming that it's true, it harkens back to Rumsfeld's memo of 6 or 7 years ago when he said, the question we have is, are we killing more than we're creating? Are we killing more terrorists than we're creating? And in that context, I just have a couple of stories, I guess, to tell you. One is that the man who was convicted of the attempt to bomb Times Square, when the judge asked him, why did you do this? He said, I did it because of all the drones that are hitting my villages and that are killing Muslims. He didn't, that was his words. A week ago, the Senate Committee on Judiciary, Senator Durbin had held hearings on drones. And the most interesting person who testified, which I really urge you to read, was a man from Yemen who started off by saying, I love America. I got 3 fellowships to study in America, in American schools. I see myself as a mouthpiece of America in Yemen, and you are making it impossible for me to do my job, to do what I want to do. He said a week before the hearing, his village, which is some very isolated village, was hit by a drone. And they apparently killed somebody who they thought was in Al-Qaeda. But nobody else in the village knew that he was in Al-Qaeda. And they also killed several people who were having some lunch or tea with him or something. And he said, now nobody in this village knows whether if they go over to their neighbor's house, they become a fair target. And it's if you could, of course, we can't imagine this as Americans because we do this in far-off places and we have no idea what it would mean if it was done against us. But if you were thinking that you could go to somebody's house and they could be a target of Iran or some other nation with drones, it would be very frightening. And he says all the people in the village are frightened, and it is affecting the way people view America, and it's creating more terrorists. And so purely as a strategic policy, it seems to me counterproductive relying on military force to defeat something which I think requires a change of our foreign policy. Instead of changing foreign policy, they've come up with drones. And that, I think, is a terrible mistake. Finally, I think it's going to come back to haunt us. There are 70 countries now who have drones. China, Iran have drones. There are, according to informed sources, 680 active drone development programs around the world. At some point, we're going to see a world with drones, and we have created a situation where we are using drones with no rules, no criteria, and while now it appears that we could do this without anybody attacking us because we have the technological superiority, within a relatively short period of time, that won't be true.
Thank you very much, Professor Lozano.
Well, as a moral philosopher and a theologian, I might feel intimidated sitting between 2 international lawyers. And I would have been intimidated, except I had breakfast with a lawyer this morning. My wife, Linda Haddad, who's sitting in the back row. It happens one of my brothers is also a lawyer, and so is his son. So we're up to my neck with lawyers in our family. I wanted to reflect just briefly events 60 years ago. My grandfather was sitting on the front steps of our house in Dakota City, Iowa, and a plane flew over. But he was talking to us about what it was like growing up in a log cabin on the frontier as the Sioux left the state. And Grandpa did a lot of work in genealogy, and he left us some books. And I've been reading some of those books where the American genocide starts in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Every September or October, some of these people would volunteer and go out and hunt Native Americans. And if you look at our whole history, from the 1630s on to the end of the 19th century, it's a destruction of the Native Americans. There's not a year goes by where somewhere we're not taking the land and moving the natives off or killing the natives if they resist. now his great-granddaughter, working at the University of Southern California, is trying to sell technology to Saudi Arabians, but also running an art gallery between technology and art. And there, they've tried to demonstrate in art the effects of technology on our civilization and on the rest of the world. Well, my lawyer wife this morning told me that she just heard NPR report that the analysts there were calling for a public discussion of drones in this country. So I'm glad that we're having it. Welcome to all of you. I think it's good that we're going to engage in this discussion. Now, as I read American foreign policy, it's a dialogue between our idealism and our realism. And these two intersect all through American history. And idealism, when it's not in touch with what's going on, is dangerous too. And realism, without taking account of American values, is just madness. The world history hasn't been much better than American history. You know, we finished up, if you accept my interpretation, that up to the end of the 19th century we're killing Native Americans. But then we have to fight in the Philippines, we have to fight in Mexico, we have to take the rest of our empire, and we find ourselves expanding our influence. We have Woodrow Wilson's little military incursions all through Central America and around the Caribbean. Then we find ourselves in World War I, and then we're preparing for the next conflict, so we have to fight Germany twice. I'm born in 1939. I have not seen a year of my life when American military force hasn't been active somewhere in the world. We are, to some extent, children of this warring state, even though, like a person like myself, wants to accept responsibility for defending this American empire. Now, those are hard words for some of you, I know, but as long as we're paying our taxes, we are citizens of the American empire, and we're supporting the defense of it, but we may also be defending a lot of offense. Well, I think probably the destruction of Native Americans and the participation in the slave trade could really be called the original sins of our country, and they're still with us. Recently, in the public discourse, the concept of just war has been rising to prominence. The journal by the Society of Christian Ethics, and that's a group of ethics professors, meets once a year, but also the Jewish Society of Ethics meets with them, and also the Muslim Society of Ethics comes at the same meetings. And their last issue of their journal, on their issue of just war, quoted Michael Walzer's book, Arguing About War. Now, it happens that I think the just war theory has really been worked on at Princeton more than most of our other academic institutions. In Christian discourse, the work of Paul Ramsey was definitive for Protestant understanding of just war, even though we might have rejected some of his own political calculations. And now Michael Walzer happens to be a Jew, professor of political philosophy at Princeton, has been developing just war theory. This article asserts that just war theory has become the dominant way of talking about issues of war and peace, at least in the academic world of North America. Well, to the extent that's true, let me try and apply it a little bit to the situation we're in. Now, just war sometimes is called a theory. Sometimes mistakenly in Christian discourse it's called a doctrine. But I would rather refer to it as a tradition, because there are many different schools within it and many different articulations of just war theory. It has nothing to do, well, almost nothing to do, with Christian revelation. It's a part of natural reason, and it arises first in importance with Augustine in the 5th century. Augustine, who's a bishop, think of a political bishop, thinks North Africa, the Roman Empire, is worth defending against the Vandals, who also incidentally are Christian, but they're Arians, not Orthodox. And so advises his friend Count Boniface not to go live in the monastery, but to do his duty as a general and defend the empire. Now, Augustine, according to interpretation by Paul Ramsey, is acting out of love when he articulates a just war theory. He's saying there are people who are innocent, who in many situations must be defended. If you love your neighbor, you're going to have to defend that neighbor against unjust attacks. From Augustine, it doesn't have so much influence in the Middle Ages until Thomas Aquinas picks it up, merges it with Aristotelian thought that's been brought by Islamic sources to Europe. And then Thomas spells it out pretty closely to the classical way it's been articulated. Later, it goes into more secular philosophy, and Grotius articulates it, and it keeps getting refined through the centuries. But basically, 7 principles. Last resort being the first one, arguing in just war theory, you can't go up against your opponents, you're a nation, unless it's the last resort, the last thing you can do. Now, no one would argue, I think, that the wars in either Iraq or Afghanistan were the last thing the United States could have done. It does insist on lawful declaration by legal authority, and we could argue about that. I would tend myself to think Iraq's in a different category than Afghanistan. The Pope and the UN both supported the move into Afghanistan, and Congress authorized force. But certainly the war in Iraq doesn't have that kind of authority behind it. It must have a just cause. It means that there must be a real wrong being inflicted, not made up talk about weapons of mass destruction. If you're going after oil and you say you're bringing democracy to the world, that's not a just cause. They say the war must be fought with just intent. Just intent means that what you're really looking for in your struggle is to defend yourself against the aggressor and to establish peace. The other criteria of probability of success makes you don't go to war for a foolish cause or where you can't win. You don't send your children out to die on the wrong barricades. It's just a postulate of human reason. And then it's brought into the means must be just. And the means have usually devolved into 2 principles. Once, the immunity of civilians, and second, the proportionality arguments that your struggles must be proportional to the goal you're trying to achieve. And that all comes under the just means. And so that brings in the drone question. I think the best source on the killing of civilians is probably the paper done by the 2 institutes, one at NYU and one at Stanford, called Living Under Drones. And that's available on the internet. It's all available on the internet. If you want to see a predator attacking, just dial in the internet under Google, look under predator. If you want to hear about the drones industry that's building up, again, dial into drones, or Dayton, Ohio, if you want, which is developing many drone products, or at least unmanned aerial vehicles. To say unmanned aerial vehicles sounds so sexist that I almost rather use the word drone in this case. Now, on civilian deaths, it's hard to estimate exactly, but I put together the various sources, and I think somewhere between 20% and 40% of the casualties reported are civilians. Now, this certainly is disproportionate to any of the goals to go after any one. I can conceive of situations where a drone might be used with different armament in a just war situation. I mean, I'm not absolutely against drones, and the intelligence gathered may be useful when you're in a conflict situation. But the latest information I have, anyway, is we're arming the drones with Hellfire missiles. Hellfire missiles are intended to take out tanks. And so when you hit a little car in the middle of a town with a Hellfire missile, everything explodes. There's a recording of an attack in September of 2011 on 3 Taliban representatives who were visiting with village leaders in a bus depot. And it was hit with a Hellfire missile. The 40 village leaders, elders, were all destroyed. There went all your political leadership of the whole surrounding area. And of course, a Hellfire missile, which will blow your organs out at 25 meters away, killed the children around there too. The testimony coming out of North Waziristan is by the cripples and people who've had their homes blown up. And as they testify to the lawyers from Stanford and NYU, they say, we didn't know who America was. And we certainly don't know why America is attacking like this. So I think the civilian disaster with the way they're armed now is what really rules them out. A couple weeks ago, my wife and I were in Senegal. And there in Senegal, sitting out on the tarmac at the airport, was an AWAC, American intelligence gathering plane with a big radar sitting on top of it. And we asked a representative of the American embassy what it was doing there. And she gave us a very vague answer about some trouble in a little country farther south. But as you all know, we're putting drones into Central Africa along with the troops necessary to protect them. So we're finding ourselves moving this technology into support of France in countries which these were all previously French colonies. You know, the last time we did that in any great way was, of course, Vietnam. So the possibilities of engaging in this high-tech warfare in Africa are getting closer and closer to us. Well, where do we move? I think there's, in the paper I prepared, there was a handout. I obviously preferred the whole Christian tradition of just peacemaking over that of just war. Support for international organizations, humane social development, creating peace institutions, strengthening the United Nation, admitting your national sins and asking for forgiveness. There are a whole range of practices of just peacemaking, which is a much more profound theory, I think, than just war. But even those engaging in just peacemaking know that in the world we live in, we may be attacked. And so there probably needs for a just war criteria to sort out how you're going to fight and how you're going to respond if you are attacked. In addition to just peacemaking, we have to start reducing the power of our empire. There are whole areas of the world that we do not need to patrol. And I would suggest 2 obvious ones are the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean. Now, you may have your own expansive areas, but there's a need to really pull back or we're going to be doing stupid things. Now, the drones cannot be used morally in the general warfare. The Supreme Court has said police have to have a warrant to give you a blood test if they suspect you're driving while intoxicated. Goodness sakes, we need a legal critique and procedures for dealing with weapons like the drones and the higher technology. And so Congress is going to have to come together and establish a framework by which drones may legally be used in extreme situations. One extreme situation I'd mention is my brother was on a ship in the Indian Ocean when it was attacked by pirates. Now, I can see a possibly just use of drones to patrol some sea lanes, and maybe even if an attack is imminent or going to happen, I can even see it as a possible weapon. And you can think of other situations where you wouldn't rule out the drone technology entirely. But I'll end with a quote from Michael Walzer, again, one of my favorite philosophers. He wrote a book a long time ago called Exodus and Revolution. Oh, I want to precede this by saying You know, we have taken stands against poison gas. We have taken stands against, maybe not the United States, but most of the world has taken a legal stand against landmines. We have created a moral atmosphere that the use of atomic weapons is almost morally impossible to argue for. And something like that on the drone issue needs to be brought forward. Well, how do we get there? Well, Walzer ends this book, Exodus and Revolution, by saying, wherever you are, it's Egypt. Think of Moses in Egypt. And wherever you are, you have a vision of a promised land, something better. And the only way to get there is to get organized and go marching. And I think that's the case vis-a-vis this technology we're using. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stone. Let's give a round for all three of these speakers. We're really glad to have them in this thoughtful discussion to get started, as called for by NPR this very morning. I'd like to start off the questions with just sort of a warm-up. They can tell me if this is too complex or irrelevant, and I'll start with Dr. Stone. The others can comment if they wish. And my question has to do with World War II, which in the minds of many American Christians might be termed a just war. And the question would be, what about the firebombing of Dresden, for example, and the bombing of civilians generally that occurred during that war? Is that worth reflecting on for a moment or two here among Dr. Stone and the other two speakers? And then we'll take questions from the audience.
Well, I think it's pretty obvious that the whole discussion of the tradition of just war stands against the bombing of cities. And there were some who, using reflections from just war, argued that way during World War II. Of course, there were honest pacifists during World War II as well, but there were those who were not pacifists, even some like Reinhold Niebuhr, who led the interventionist struggle, who was clearly against bombing cities. So when the nuclear weapon was dropped, the president of Yale argued, if you're against the dropping of the atomic bomb, must we give up all the ways we're fighting? And the answer was, you don't have to give up all the ways you're fighting, but you have to give up the bombing of cities. When this was first done, the civilized world rebelled against the bombing of cities. It's on every ground immoral and horrible.
Just two comments on that. One really has to do with Professor Stone's talk on just war. It seems to me that one of the things this drones does is makes war easier. And therefore it changes the whole calculus of war from to what extent should we really go to war because it's necessary, because we may sacrifice, we may have to lose some soldiers, to the extent that you can engage in killing with what appears to be no consequence to your own country. It changes the whole decision-making process, and that to me is one of the most frightening things about these drones. The second thing is that the administration argument is that this is very different than the bombing of Dresden because these are precision weapons, and that what we've done is we're targeting a specific house or a specific car or something like that. And I think that's what we have to grapple with. And my response to that, which they would say makes it different than Dresden. In fact, this is why we've improved. We're no longer bombing whole cities, we're bombing houses. And to me, the two answers to that is it doesn't matter if you bomb a house or a car or a wedding in one small location if there are 50 people there. You may not be killing hundreds of thousands of people, but you're still killing 50 people because you think there's one militant there. And that's still disproportionate and unacceptable. But second, and in a way more fundamental, everything that you're doing is based on in some intelligence. And if your intelligence is wrong, you're going to bomb the Chinese embassy, as they did in the Yugoslav war, where they said, this was, a Serbian military installation.
Because when we're talking about World War II and the bombing of Dresden and dropping the nuclear weapons on Japan, there were certainly people in this country who argued against that under the just war theory. Yes, it was just ad bellum to get into the war. We were attacked. But then the question comes, what is justified to do within the war itself? And there are different strains of thought. We've been talking through the lens of just war theory coming from the religious, moral, ethical, philosophical background of the West, but there's also a whole other tradition that comes through the military ethics line of thought. And in the 19th century, it was pretty much, it was very developed in military ethics that they were not to target civilians. Maybe it didn't come exactly from the just war theory, but it was a theory of limited warfare. You had armies on the field with horses attacking each other, okay? And the officers were supposed to, as part of their duties of officers, I guess I'm going a little longer than I should, was to control the men, to keep them from pillaging, raping, and destroying the hinterlands, etc. Then there was a change, an idea that we could have total war theory. Clausewitz, these people came up with this idea. And so the idea was that you would break the spirit of the whole country. You would attack their gardens and go after whole cities. And that was justified somehow by the idea that if you had this huge attack on one city, all the other cities would sort of fall away. So I don't think that I don't agree with total war theory, but I think that's where this idea of bombing of Dresden, it's kind of came out of that tradition. Back to Islamic law, it's certainly not a position that would be justified under Islamic just war theory as far as what you're supposed to do within the war. And I'd also like to agree with you that we're talking about proportionality. And if you're after one person and you know you're going to kill 50 people and you don't care, that is morally just as disgusting as being after 100 people and killing 1,000. So.
If you look at a case going on in New York City right now about what the police in New York City take to be reasonable suspicion to stop and frisk somebody, you'll see that this notion of reasonable suspicion is a very, very vague and ambiguous concept. And that's why I've just seen too much reliance on military intelligence to say, trust us. And that's what got us into the war in Iraq.
Bit on a different topic, but I think it is on the topic of just war. We're now at the 10th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and one reporter, Dar Jamal, actually went to Baghdad and met with at least one doctor who is recording evidence of the number of birth defects of children as a result of depleted uranium. So I get a little confused about issues of just war and total war from an academic perspective. Is the use of depleted uranium just war? I mean, we're talking about drones, but what about other weapons that are used by the U.S. government? Secondly, is the use of drones in American cities, is that unacceptable? Would that be acceptable? I think that was used in Boston.
And I also think just war theory, but international law prohibits certain kinds of weapons because they're indiscriminate. So chemical weapons, the problem with chemical weapons is they're indiscriminate. They don't just kill soldiers, they kill everybody. And I think depleted uranium fall within that category. There has never been a treaty specifically outlawing depleted uranium, but I think under the general principles of international law, namely weapons that do not distinguish between military and civilian populations, depleted uranium ought to be banned, just as cluster bombs ought to be banned. It's the same problem. When Israel used cluster bombs in Lebanon, half of them don't explode, and for years later, civilians are being killed. And the argument, and there is an attempt at a cluster bomb treaty, is that this is a weapon that's indiscriminate. And so that's, I think, the basic proposition. And to my mind, depleted uranium would fall within that.
Another question? In the back?
This is kind of a follow-up and may be directed more to Mr. Stone, but in my understanding of the work that's come post-World War II regarding the changed calculus after the atomic weapons were used, writers like Merton and even papal encyclicals like Pacem in Terris have really departed from just war theory in seeing all war as evil. And so that we've spent the whole time not even lifting up the possibility that just war no longer exists. I just wondered if we could at least speak to that, because there's a lot of writing from traditional mainline sources about that.
Many of the Catholic ethicists that I read think Pacem in Terris was a little naive, that it really thought that humanity could live without these struggles. And Protestant critics of Pacem in Terris particularly, who believe that humanity's sinful, nations are not well organized, the international order is mostly disorder, think that they better serve the cause if they think in terms of joining their idealism with realism and trying to limit the wars and to say what's most horrible. So there is a real debate around Pacem in Terris. This last issue I mentioned of the Journal of Christian Ethics by two young Catholic ethicists is trying to expand and tighten up the language about just war. Thomas Merton's position is obviously different. Thomas Merton is a pacifist, and the sort of discourse that I've been talking about is not pacifist with the way Thomas Merton was. This is a difference in theological ethics.
Hello. I hope you will excuse me, forgive me for making a comment more so than a question. I mean, I'd like to thank you for you're taking time to try to understand and resolve the issues that are currently between the Muslim community and the non-Muslim community. It's really rare to see a group of people trying to grapple with this. And I'd like to thank you for that. My comment is that my suggestion is, if you are going to continue to have these type of dialogues and conversations, that it would really contribute to the conversation, I think, to have an Islamic scholar, to someone who can describe accurately the grievances and someone who can accurately describe what Islamic jurisprudence requires and what it states. But I want to thank you for taking this on.
It's always very difficult within 15 minutes to give an accurate and full accounting of anything having to do with Islamic jurisprudence. When you have such a short amount of time to make a point, it becomes necessary to generalize, and in generalizing, there's always distortion. So I do apologize if I said something that you disagree with, but I'd be happy to talk with anybody at length after this. Thank you.
I wanted to say that all three of our speakers did an excellent job on a very complex subject in 20 minutes each. So this is a very rich conversation, and hopefully it'll continue beyond this point. But the next question?
But I have a real concept with just war as opposed to necessary war. And I think there is such a thing as a necessary war when people feel that they are being so attacked that they must defend themselves. And in many, many ways, I find the acts of the people in many of the Arab nations that we are currently attacking as necessary for their own defense. And if we accept that, then which is the immoral and who is the immoral body in this? Where is the U.S. in immorality compared to the morality of many people in the Arab nations and other nations that we're currently attacking?
But as I indicated, I think the just peacemaking theory, which is more recent, goes further. But let's admit it, most Christians just do what their prince, king, dictator, or president says. And most Christians don't reason much about war or peace. And my point about the Journal of Christian Ethics was just an argument that the just war criteria and discussion has become much richer since the Vietnam War in particular, and Walzer, at least, who's been pushing it, thinks it's now dominant in academia. He may be right or wrong, but he's not right vis-a-vis the general public. The pacifist position has so much truth in it and is a solid theory. I personally don't think in the end it's really morally responsible, but that's just me. The idea of the agonized participant is another theory. Responsible people don't use just war. They think about history and politics and what's going on, and they make up their decisions. So there are at least 5 different ways to approach the subject within the Christian churches, and they all have their own legitimacy, and some are better for one thing and some are better for another. It's how I would respond off the top of my head.
Let me just say one thing about just war, although I'm in no way a Christian scholar. International law coming out of World War II, particularly the UN Charter and the Nuremberg trials, attempted to recapture just war theory. And the way it attempted to do that was to draw a sharp line based on self-defense, on an armed attack. Namely, under contemporary international law, there is no basis for the use of force except in response to an armed attack against you. That's the only category. I mean, you don't have to go through 7 principles. For lawyers, we like to keep things simplistic because lawyers have simple minds in a way. And therefore, that was the clear, sharp line. And the UN Charter says, actually, you cannot use force except in response to an armed attack. Not an imminent armed attack, but an armed attack. The history since World War II and since the drafting of the UN Charter, which was, of course, done in large part by the United States, is the history of imperial countries and international law generally, which is an expansion of the notion of self-defense. So the Roman Empire, as Schlesinger wrote, always used the notion of self-defense. They never engaged in any aggressive, unjust wars. They were always defending themselves. And if you look at the history of the United States legal establishment since 1945, it's the history of an attempt to expand the notion of self-defense, which you see the most latest reiteration of that in the Obama justification for these drone attacks, namely the expansion of the notion of imminence. First, it was the use of the notion of imminence, which in the UN Charter never appears, and now it's the expansion of notion of imminence. So what I would say is, number one, under international law, the notion has to be clearly tied to a notion of self-defense. But secondly, I do think this war in Afghanistan tests that notion, because arguably the United States was engaged in a war of self-defense after September 11th. And NATO, the United States UN Security Council, all said there was an armed attack against the United States, justifying self-defense. In my view, and so that's the international law perspective, which the U.S. argues and which Obama argues. In my view, it shows the limitation of self-defense in the sense that not all self-defense is justified. So it may be that there are, first of all, you have to look at the general context, which I think is what Mel was talking about. When you have 700 bases around the world and people are angry at you and they're attacking you, the question is, even if there's an attack against you and it's based on self-defense, and you have a right to self-defense, is the necessary, proportionate, reasonable strategy to attack back and to fuel the continued attack? So even if there is justification under international law, I don't think it's necessary or the wisest policy. So it raises this point of, is self-defense the be-all and end-all of just war theory or of reasonable use of force?
One of the things is exploitation. If you notice, each of our governments ignores what we want. They've been scamming us, been out of money, and that has nothing to do with this, of course, but it has to do with the policy that we see our governments disrespect us. They don't really care what we think, and it doesn't matter what we think. However, you know, our country operates under the theory that might makes right. We've got all this technology that we've been using, and we've gotten over everyone. We've been able to beat up on everyone. We're over in Pakistan with people who wear turbans and cloths, and Afghanistan the same way. Osama bin Laden did exactly the same thing we planned to do to him. He attacked us, but he attacked us first. We had planned to attack Osama bin Laden, so we just punished him by killing him for doing the same thing that we intended to do to him. But as I said again, you know, we're taking advantage of everyone around the country. We're arrogant. We've become very arrogant because we have high technology. We feel we can defeat anyone we want. So it doesn't matter what they think. It doesn't matter that, as I said again, might makes right. That's what counts. And they don't care. So as I say, the people in Pakistan have autonomous governments, and in Afghanistan and Pakistan have autonomous governments. But yet they don't want us there doing what we're doing, but we're doing anyway. We're using drones.
Thank you for the statement, Mr. Plato. Do you want to just add a quick question to it?
Well, I want to know if the panel really feels this is a moral issue.
Thank you.
I definitely feel it's a moral issue, and I guess that raises the question that Kate raised before about the role of drones in the United States. One of the things that is both positive and yet troubling at the same time is that the way the drone issue has really gotten traction is when they started killing U.S. citizens and when the idea came that they could use drones in the United States. I'm obviously opposed to that, but it's tied into this moral issue, because then it became a practical issue of whether or not we could actually be attacked by our own government using drones. And while the Center for Constitutional Rights, for example, has sued based on American citizenship, because when an American citizen gets killed or attacked, then you can get some more traction in court, we believe more generally as a moral issue, it shouldn't just be limited to the use of drones in the United States or the use of drones against U.S. citizens, but it's a broader moral issue involving the use of drones more generally.
After many months, I do think that our Attorney General finally said that I, as an American citizen, would not be killed by a drone in the United States. I think he said that, but it took a long time for him to get to that point.
Well,
next question.
For me, the most important thing is how we can stop the use of drones, and because they are, in my opinion, illegal and criminal, their use. And so my question is addressed mainly to Jules. Is there any move to indict the administration, the present administration, for the use of drones as a criminal act against international law? And is there any body, such as the Center for Constitutional Rights or other such body, trying to bring a legal case against the administration to stop the use of drones?
Well, as I say, we have brought cases against this administration with respect to the use of drones. We lost the first case, which was a case brought when they had announced that Anwar al-Awlaki was going to be targeted, and he was an American citizen. And we lost that case because the court said it was a political question, and they couldn't resolve it. We've now sued for damages on behalf of his son who was killed in a separate attack, and on behalf of somebody else who wasn't targeted, who was also killed, and also on behalf of his heirs. So we have legal cases, and we're challenging it. I wouldn't hold your breath about getting damages on it, but that's our claim. Let me just say one thing that you said, which may be provocative, but you said that drones are criminal and illegal. I want to throw out a question of whether that's true. That whether it's the drones that are criminal or illegal, or bombers that are criminal or illegal, or Predator or cruise missiles that are criminal or illegal, or whether it's the use of them in these circumstances that's criminal or illegal. And so that would be my question. I mean, I think there are some weapons, like chemical weapons or nuclear weapons, that are either criminal and illegal or should be. Drones, I don't see that big a distinction between killing somebody with a drone and killing somebody with a cruise missile fired from a fighter plane. I do think that it raises the question on just war theory of whether or not it makes war so easy that you go to war without the proper calculus. But as a weapon, I would say what's problematic is the way they're using it, and not the mere fact of drone, of the technology. That would be my view. I also think it's unfortunate that we're spending all our money developing drones and cruise missiles and all the rest of that. But that's not because they're per se illegal, but because we have a wrong-headed military and foreign policy.
I recently read or heard on television that the topic was around drones and spying on people. Do you know anything about that, or is that issue being...
I do know that Iran is developing drones, so that, we as Americans have this sort of blasé attitude of killing thousands of people in other countries. And maybe one way and this goes back to Michael's point of what you can do about it, one way of trying to impact the American people is to say, this could happen here, not because our government's going to kill us, but because many other governments are going to develop this. And if we could kill somebody because they're having a tea with somebody who we suspect is an Al-Qaeda member, they could kill us because we're having tea with somebody who might be an FBI agent or a CIA agent or a military person. And what we're doing is going to have blowback in a number of ways in this country.
I was wondering, so Obama is still operating under the war on terror that was passed after September 11th, 2001. How much oversight does Congress have on that? And would Congress be able to retract that war on terror that he's operating under if they desired?
Two answers to that. The woman in the audience gave as good an answer as I could, which was none. And second, in terms of congressional oversight. Second, unfortunately, what Congress certainly could, and I actually have worked with a Congressman, Walter B. Jones, who's a very conservative Republican congressman, who was wanted to retract that authorization, as well as Barbara Lee, a congresswoman from California, who's also seeking to retract that authorization. Unfortunately, Congress has gone in the other direction, and in the National Defense Authorization Act of 2011 and 2012, has explicitly affirmed the administration's authority not only to engage in, not only to detain and use force against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, but so-called associated forces. So they have, at least implicitly, expanded his authority. I mean, he claims that that was the authority they always had under the AUMF. And Christopher Hedges, a journalist, sued, saying this puts us all at risk as American citizens. And they then scrambled to say, no, we're not going to use it against American citizens. But the broad problem is that Congress, instead of contracting the authorization, if anything, is expanding the authorization.
At this point, then, I'll ask the panelists, all three of them, if they wanted to add anything at this point for the general order.
Yeah, I'll make this brief. I thought that this was a very important panel to discuss the drone program and also from different ethical positions. I think that the drone program is a continuation of something that I've seen since 9/11, but really from many years before that, and I think it's an erosion of our basic fundamental values in the U.S. that do come from a background, Judeo-Christian background, but are also very compatible with Muslim ethics and ethics in lots of different traditions. And the woman over here mentioned something about the use of drones for spying. I think that's the next step. And I think that they can be used by our government to spy on American citizens. That's a different discussion. But the idea that we can have secret panels going out and deciding to kill people, whether over there or here, is something that we should take very seriously. And as Americans, we should question also the use of torture and all of those things. So I think these are very useful discussions, and I'm very glad to have been here today and be part of it.
Thank you for inviting me. Because of the weaknesses or the suspectness of intelligence, Supreme Court has held that people captured and detained at Guantanamo have a right to a hearing. But if you're just going to kill somebody with no right to a hearing, what does that mean? And I guess my final thought is that I've spoken too long and I'll shut up.
I think the first time I heard about drones was in that old movie from 1978, Battlestar Galactica. And there the drones were the ones who were trying to take out the Earthlings. And that model, myth, motif has impressed me deeply. I agree with Mr. Plato, and the problem at the heart is the arrogance of the Americans. In the Bible, every time spies are mentioned, they're called liars, by the way, and that's worth remembering. It's, if you can dream it, you can build it. But if you don't bring your ethics and moral philosophy on to bear on your dreams, they just become nightmares. And there's a lot of work to be done here, and I hope you all will find a way to do it.
Well, there are 60 people here today. We took a count, and so there are 60 people who are going to continue to think about this and work on it and or pray about it. And if anyone is interested in having a DVD of these proceedings, you can speak to the filmmaker, Rich Fishkin, here. And finally, in conclusion, let's thank from the bottom of our hearts these three wonderful speakers.